So welcome back now for the discussion session where I get to do double duty as the discussant and the chair, and I've asked my colleague to warn me about the time. So I wanted to begin, first of all, by thanking Marta for all of the work and the other organizers. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I also wanted to express my regrets that I couldn't be here this morning because of teaching. So if I repeat everything you already heard, sorry, it's new to me. Perhaps you were thinking while listening to these three important papers that it would be a challenge to think of something to say in response to them. This is true. However, there's one thing that makes it much easier in my case, which is that within the last 10 days here in Toronto, we have had conferences on precisely each and every one of these precise topics. Last week on Wednesday, Dr. Stephanie Karaza at the Azrieli Foundation hosted a day-long seminar on sexual violence in the Holocaust. My colleague, Professor Sternschus, was there, as well as me and others in this room. On Thursday. The previous day, on Wednesday, we hosted a lunchtime seminar on the Polish, quote, Holocaust law, featuring a presentation by my colleague Piotr Rubel, here in the room with us, and by Dan Mickman, one of the three signatories of the Yad Vashem statement that we heard mentioned. And then on Monday and Tuesday of this very week, our colleague Ori Yehudai organized a two-day conference on the aftermath of the Second World War, Global Jewish Perspectives, and I chaired a panel titled Israel and the Post-War Jewish World. Thank you very much, Rotem Giladi, for your paper. So although these topics seem diffuse in my mind, they are all actually quite fresh, but the disadvantage is that my mind is racing and it's maybe hard to pull together the main points. I want to organize my comment around, I think, three topics, each of them linked to one of the papers, but all of them relevant to all three papers. So the topics are sexual violence, education, and violent contexts. In her paper, Annette Tim argues that it's necessary to integrate the subject of sexual violence into discussions of the Holocaust. And of course, the flip side of the necessity is the argument that clearly scholars and others have failed to do so to date. She offers a bundle of explanations for this failure, and I want to just read a short passage from her paper that I think sums up some of the important points. She says, evidence of sexual abuse, rape, quote, is less rich than it might be simply because historians have rarely looked for it. A failure of imagination that can be explained with two somewhat contradictory assumptions: that sexual violence accompanies war as a matter of course, and that the laws against sexual intercourse between Jews and, quote, Aryans, the prohibitions against Rassenschande, race defilement, were actually obeyed. I want to suggest that I agree with Professor Tim, but in fact to say the failure of integration is much, much worse than what this passage, and I think her paper, describes. She focuses on sexual violence against women, shows the ways in which it has not been integrated, but I think, in fact, the disappearance of the early discussions is much more stark than you even admit. In other words, that the failure of integration, I think at least, is not about scholars not having the tools, because in fact, those tools were present and those topics were present in many, many early sources, materials of all kinds. And just to give one very small example, in my graduate class yesterday, we read The Unknown Black Book. Discussions of sexual abuse are on practically every page. Usually people not describing their own experiences, but describing what they witnessed or heard from others. For example, the testimony of Emilia Kotlova, written in Kiev in 1945, January, makes just in passing a mention to a young Jewish girl she met in jail who talks about an almost rape, and on the next page describes what she saw and heard at the massacre of Jews at Babi Yar. As she wrote, quote, Before killing them, they still had time to rape the women. Sexual violence about women has been written about almost solely by historians of women, almost all of whom are women. So there's a failure to integrate the scholarship that does exist. But there's also, one could say, an even starker failure to integrate the topic of sexual violence against men, which is ubiquitous. It's mentioned all the time in sources, again, often briefly and in passing. Not always rape, but certainly mutilation, different forms of torture, targeting genitals. This topic is rarely addressed. And finally, I think a third level is we heard about the failure to integrate sexual violence into what it helps us understand about victims and their trauma. A topic even less often addressed is what does sexual violence help us understand about the perpetrators, how they constructed power, how they created impunity, how they created systems of rewards and discipline vis-a-vis each other. So I think there's even more to do. Now, if we think about the challenge of integrating sexual violence, it seems to me we can also think about our two other papers. Danny Blattman's paper, talking about the so-called Holocaust law, does not mention something that my colleague Piotr Rubel has formulated very elegantly, and I'm not sure if I can do it justice. It's about the discussion around rescue and rescuers. And if I'm getting it right, I believe, Piotr, that you've said something like, the number of rescuers and righteous claimed in Poland is directly proportional to sort of the awfulness of the discourse in which it's being invoked. In other words, the issue of rescuers, deeply, deeply politicized and a crucial part of creating a so-called usable narrative. But what does one do in the discussion of rescuers with Molly Applebaum's rescuer, with whom she and her cousin, as we heard, had sexual relations while they were hiding under the floor in a box under his barn? He's been declared righteous among the nations, nominated by Molly Applebaum herself. Or what about the three abusers whom Annette Tim mentioned in her paper, connected with a religious establishment who, it seems like, serially molested the Jewish children in their care? In other words, the connection between sheltering vulnerable children and sexually abusing them is not at all rare and unusual. And if you stop and think about the dynamics of those situations, people who had literally absolutely no standing, no protection, nothing in the world, it's not at all surprising. So it seems to me actually the situation or the discussion of sexual issues does help us see what's at stake with Danny Blattman's paper too. Now, Rotem Giladi's paper also, I think, raises some interesting issues that can benefit from an integration to discussions of sexual violence. We heard about the break between notions of diaspora, a Zionist rejection of diaspora, and how this conflict played out in discussions around the Genocide Convention. Reading your paper made me think about an essay by Miriam Sivan, some of you may know it, called Stoning the Messenger, Yehiel Denur's House of Dolls and People, where she quotes the poem by Palmach founder Yitzhak Sadeh, probably well known to many of you, My Sister on the Beach, which embodies the form of diaspora Jewry with the body of a raped woman. And the first lines of the poem translated as follows, quote, "Darkness, on wet sand, my sister stands before me, dirty, disheveled, matted hair, her feet bare, and her head lowered. She stands and sobs. I know she is tattooed for officers only." So the work of integration, I think, involves not only thinking about the topic of sexual violence, but thinking about the many ways in which it has been written about and thought about, and allowing those materials into the discourse. Let me turn to the issue of education. I want to use Danny Blattman's paper to raise this issue, which may seem a bit unfair because he actually never mentions it. But I thought about it when I read this passage from the paper, the version that I received. Quote, "The Polish National Memory Law's tendentious presentation of the extremely complex problems related to the relations among Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians in Eastern Poland did not attract attention or even passing mention in the controversy triggered by the amendments to Article 55. Poland was attacked by Israeli politicians and Holocaust historians, primarily those affiliated with Yad Vashem. Poland was accused of attempting to conceal the Poles' participation in the murder of the Jews during the war. And savaged for having imposed criminal sanctions on academic freedom, literary composition, and artistic expression about the Holocaust. However, since Article 55A, Part 3, absolves scholarship in the arts, this charge seems to have been unfounded. Now again, at our discussion of the Polish law, my colleague Piotr Rubel noted that, first of all, there's no definition of what constitutes scholarship in the arts. So what does it mean to exempt them? When, for instance, the example he gave, Jan Gross's book Fear is considered scholarship, but Neighbors is not. But he also, just in passing, made the really interesting point that there's no exemption for education. There's no exemption for education. So who is on the front line of presenting what Professor Blattman refers to as those approved narratives of national memory, if not teachers and educators of every kind? So it seems to me it's important to think about the stakes for our discussion and the ways in which so often education in Holocaust studies and in genocide studies is waved around as the solution and the answer to all problems. I thought about the work of Professor Diana Dumitru, who talks about how significant Soviet programs of education were in the region of Transnistria in affecting the way that Gentiles dealt with Jews during the Holocaust, in that case giving a positive example, but one can also think about negative examples. So education, it seems to me, something that really bears more focus. Annette Tim's paper, of course, opened with an educational event. And I was thinking about the closing, again, in the version that I read from Rotem's paper, that called for a political commentary, he underlined, on the Genocide Convention and its origins, in contrast to heroic, kind of moral triumphalist version. And I read that to be a way of talking about the Genocide Convention that isn't mere propaganda, that is a critical political version, that to me embodied what real education is, let's say promoting thinking in the style of Hannah Arendt, thinking as the essence of ethical behavior. And finally, the third point, violent contexts. I didn't know if that was the right heading, but I wanted to say something about this. In Rotem Galadi's paper, he draws our attention, I think very powerfully, to the simultaneity of two, what he calls Jewish campaigns at the UN, the Genocide Convention and the discussion around partition of Palestine and admission of the Jewish state. And again, I'm just going to read really briefly to remind you of his words, not mine. Quote, he writes frequently, frequently, to avoid having the convention entangled in the UN-Palestine debate and the ensuing dynamics of the Mideast conflict, Lemkin played down the Jewish aspect of the convention. You heard this part. His close cooperation with Arab and Muslim diplomats in the promotion of the convention entailed frequent praise showered on Arab and Muslim diplomats. One memorandum he authored in the 1950s was titled The Genocide Convention and the Muslim World. Lemkin's advocacy kept faith with the cause of the Genocide Convention and no other. I was interested in reading that passage to hear more about the relationship between those two programs, not only for Lemkin, but for you and your analysis. And I also thought about the paper that I heard at Ori Yehudai's conference on the aftermath of World War II by Shai Hazkani from the University of Maryland, who's completed a book using the personal letters of Israeli and Arab soldiers from the 1948 war. Hazkani analyzes the multiple and conflicting links between the Holocaust and the experience of violence, both as dishing it out and receiving it in 1944. He talks about, quote, the elaborate discussion at the time as to whether it made sense to teach Jews to hate. And I thought about the multiple vectors of violence in that situation, and the way in which they contrast with how I think the concept of genocide, at least now, maybe not as Lemkin thought of it, has become quite simple and unidirectional, so maybe not easily allowing a space for some of these more entangled webs. Danny Blattman's paper draws our attention, I think in a really important way, to those important changes regarding Ukrainians, crimes of Ukrainian nationalists, extension of the time period. But I also thought of a moment in his paper where he notes that in the context of the years 1945 to 47, and especially 1947, with the expulsion of Ukrainians from Eastern Poland, you see a blurring of the victim and hero status that the law and its amendments seeks so strenuously to assert. And finally, Annette Tim's paper, too, has just a brief gesture toward the colonial context here in Canada of the situation that she describes. The fact that, of course, the most open discourse of recent years about sexual violence has involved Indigenous children in residential schools. And we know that, in fact, it was the open discussion by some of those survivors that emboldened a Holocaust survivor, Nate Leipziger, who had never spoken openly about his sexual abuse in the Holocaust, to do so. And yet, I think at least many Canadians, if they were asked to say, what does the Genocide Convention have to do with Canada? The sexual abuse and the genocide of Indigenous people would not be what came to their minds. It would rather be the name John Humphrey, who authored the original draft and is described in Canadian Encyclopedia as, quote, probably author of the most cited legal document drafted by a Canadian. Our session is called, or was the question asked in our session was how is the Holocaust-Shoah conceptualized in relation to the concept of genocide? I'm not really sure about the answer, but I think those two categories are mutually constituted. And I think it remains a challenge to find ways to contextualize and analyze cases of extreme violence without merely excusing, to complicate the targets and victims without merely accusing, and to think about the many ways in which the interpretive, ethical, political, and legal concept requires constant interrogation. Thanks.
Can you hear me? Okay. So, first of all, I want to thank the participants to this very diverse panel, because I have research interests which are very far from those of the panelists, and so it was a real occasion to learn something new, to confront different approaches, and all of which need to be taken into account if we are to fully understand the evolution of the concept of genocides, as well as its power and pitfalls. So hereafter, I'm trying to comment on each specific intervention separately, and I will start with Daniel Blattman, which is a paper that takes on a very tricky subject, that of memory laws, and it is a paper which is truly relevant not just for Holocaust history, not just for Polish history, but for a worldwide phenomenon now, because there are memory laws all over Europe, but there are also memory laws outside Europe. I know one in Rwanda, another in Cambodia. I think one was discussed in Bangladesh. So it's a worldwide phenomenon, and I think that when discussing it, we should take into account this global background. And I agree with Blattman's conclusions that all legislation related to Holocaust denial, even when motivated with good intentions, serves a narrative suited to molding society's preferred historical memory. And exactly because of that, my first comments regards Russia, or rather its absence in the paper. Because a Russian law was adopted in 2014, and it penalizes dissemination of knowingly false information on the activities of USSR during World War II. And I wonder if this Russian example somehow influenced the Polish one. I don't know, so it's just a question I'm posing. And also, I mean, part of the way the law is law makes it illegal to accuse the Polish people or crimes committed by individual Poles. And so it is different from the Russian one or even the Turkish one that criminalize insults to the memory of an oppressive regime. So the difference is significant, but still I wonder if there were any influence. And thus I will want to summarize my point as follows. On one hand, memory laws are a worldwide phenomenon, and one which is best perhaps understood as something originating in Europe but then diffusing all over the world. And the second thing is such laws can also be seen as a byproduct of the very circulation of the concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide, because the earliest memory laws had to do with the Holocaust. But then there were others. The French example is very interesting in this regard because there were memory laws for Armenian genocide and for other events. And then there are those non-European ones. So I think it's also, those laws are also an instance of the circulation of this concept, of those concepts which are discussing today. So going to Rotem Giladi's paper, I think it's obvious that history of international law is obviously central to our understanding of the concept of genocide, which was aimed originally to catching crooks rather than writing books, as goes a famous phrase, I think, by Raymond Evans. The historical research on the making of the Genocide Convention is almost a field in itself, and I think it's very right that we should read the politics of convention not merely through a contrast of the universal with the particular, and I think and that the concept of genocide was not merely a spontaneous response to the Jewish Holocaust, but rather drew on interwar Jewish experience. It is an assertion which is consistent, to my knowledge, with findings of historians of modern human rights who are now investigating their roots in the pursuit of minority rights. And I will say maybe we should even go farther back, because I remember that already in the Treaty of Berlin, 1878, there were articles regarding the civil rights of Romanian Jews and the security of Armenians. So I think it's relevant. I wonder if there is such a stark dichotomy between autonomism and Zionism in terms of Jewish nationalism, because there is at some point even Zionists were arguing that yes, we need to do the Palestinian state, but we also need to do something for people who are still in diaspora, and maybe they were not yet thinking in the 1930s that all the Jews would emigrate to Palestine. So, and also, I think it's important to remember that the Genocide Convention was drafted while the Arab-Israeli war was ongoing, that it was referenced several times by Arab states during the debates. And I mean, it seems from Zionist perspective, it is reasonable to fear that it could be used against them. And so, as I have read a very interesting paper about how identity and interest influence the Israel attitude towards apartheid, to speak about a separate subject, I wonder whether a similar mix of realpolitik and ideology was also not at work in defining the Zionist attitude towards the Genocide Convention. If it's just contrasting views of Jewish nationalism, contrasting ideologies, or there is not a politically contingent part. Well, there is a more general point. I find convincing the assessment of the Genocide Convention as the continuation of minority protection of the interwar period. I find convincing that Lemkin sought to safeguard the separate existence and cultural specificity of Jewish national minorities in Europe. But then it seems to me that it's difficult to use genocide for regarding violence against groups which are not ethnic or racial or national, so to speak. And finally, I go to Annette Tim Papers, which is an important contribution on a difficult subject. It was a difficult read, but still it's a subject which we cannot escape. And it's also timely one, given also Nobel Prize decision. Yet, in my opinion, its relevance is unhinged from any connection to present and current events. I mean, for me, the author's first response to the question of why we must add sexual violence to our definition of genocide simply because it was part of the experience of survivors suffice to make its case. And you don't need many others. If it was experienced by survivors, then it's relevant somehow. I agree that the language of the Genocide Convention was not read in a sense to include the sexual violence, and we should research why this was the case. I would add that awareness of the phenomenon of wartime sexual violence was certainly raised by the attention paid to this issue after the Bosnian and Rwandan events. But this part of mass violence was already in earlier experience. I mean, if it's enough, you just think about the Armenian case where violence was so pervasive against women. And I would add that perhaps just because in other cases this the dimension was more self-evident, perhaps it was registered earlier. I mean, and I would add that when we say that the effort to professionalize the study of Holocaust, excluding witness, is not just a peculiarity of Holocaust studies, because I remember much historiography again on the Armenian subject, and which the authors were programmatically excluding Armenian sources because they wanted only to use the one from perpetrators. I mean, this had to do also with the struggle against Turkish denialism, but still it's interesting. One last thing I want to add, that's perhaps one reason why accounts of sexual abuse were even more silenced than in other cases, that there were no effort to celebrate raped women as heroines, which is something that happened, for example, in Bangladesh. And so, I mean, the general point is that it's very interesting, even enlightening papers, which will only benefit by pursuing further comparative avenues, not limited to the one that I'm suggesting based on my knowledge. Thank you.
Did the two of you want to? Okay, so let's give them a chance to say a few words in response, and then we'll bring in the questions.
Oh my God.
I will just say it's nice. It's always a good day when the response to a paper is you should make your argument stronger and just say the same thing more. There's lots one could say. I mean, first of all, I think I had my own lens on this subject, which came from research that I was doing on the sexualization from the 70s, which was why my lens went to women more than to men. Otherwise, that would not be necessarily my instinct. And I think it's absolutely critical and even necessary and expands our view to look at the sexual abuse of men, because it was not as, I think in some ways, when you say sexual abuse in the Holocaust, people think of violent rape, penetrative rape very often, and there's such a broader spectrum of these things, humiliation of all kinds. So I can only agree with everything that Doris said. And as for this issue of women being celebrated as heroines, in a way, those two comments go together. They're in that poem that you read, My Sister on the Beach. You'd think that that was a celebration of a raped woman as a heroine, but it doesn't play out that way at all. It really doesn't play out that way, and it's actually it's a very complicated misreading, including the notion of being branded for officers only. It's a completely mythological reading of that has nothing to do with women's actual experience, and then doesn't even work as a validation of those women as somehow heroic. So it's a very interesting example of how that was not part of the Holocaust experience, but then the comparative aspect to that would be very interesting.
My first takeaway, I think, from Doris is that I came all the way to Toronto for the wrong conference. Did I hear right? All right. Couple of things, and I want to tie together one of the comments by Doris and one by Antonio. The relationship between Zionism and diaspora nationalism. The thing is that if you look at the 20s and the 30s, for Jewish scholars and activists who do international law, who approach international law, and they approach international law out of a Jewish perspective in order to address public Jewish issues most of the time is that there's a whole menu of ideological choices. And you see that with Hersch Lauterpacht, who does minority politics and Zionism, and later on what would become his human rights project, and so many different others. But by 1942, 43, 44, each of these persons that I looked at, and I looked at, I think, fairly representative group, is transformed, is making choices. So yes, historically speaking, starting in 1906, there is an overlap between diaspora nationalism and Zionism, despite original rift between them and quite major differences. But then they come apart again, and in the gap or in this contracting and expanding field between these two ideologies, this is what defines later how Israeli diplomats, sovereign Jews, after 1949, look at these matters. And this also answers your point, Doris, which I agree with very much. Back to Antonio, the Palestine conflict, which is back to you as well, and the discussion at the UN of the Genocide Convention, the two Jewish campaigns, how do they relate? Well, they don't, in ways and for reasons I've outlined already. In my book, The Genocide Convention, or the Jewish Politics of the Genocide Convention, is one of 3 case studies. Some aspect of the Human Rights Project, Hersch Lauterpacht and all that is another case study. And the third one relates to the Convention on Refugees, 1951. And what has been really surprising to me find out, based on source material, that the lawyers of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, these 2 gentlemen I was referring to, and some others, for them, they think of these instruments in almost exclusively Jewish terms. The Arab issue, the Palestinian issue, the conflict hardly comes in the discussion at all. It's there, but it's very minor. They may mention it, and they go ahead to discuss it in Jewish terms, and to basically come to account or think of it in interwar Jewish politics terms. So for what it's worth, yes, the conflict is there, and people on both sides, as I showed in the case of Robinson, try to utilize the new vocabulary for current political practice. But at the same time, the perspective is extremely particular, and particular Jewish, not particular Palestine conflict, which is, I don't know, was very surprising to me. And last, back to Antonio, 1878 and all that, if I can define it in those terms. The 2 separate questions for me, there are 2 separate questions here. How did international law approach Jewish questions, or the Jewish question, and then how did Jews approach international law? What is the Jewish engagement with international law? And of course, the 2 are not related. Here, in this book project, I focus on the Jewish engagement with international law, but the next project, the next book, is going to deal with how they conceptualize how international law approached the Jewish question. So I'm trying to complete great comments. Thank you both.
I'm going to stand there so I can see the whole room and take the questions. And maybe, should we gather a few? Because then you get to answer in more depth. So, I knew there was going to be a lot. Okay, so we're going to start the front, 1, 2, 3, and then we'll take the next round. Go ahead.
Actually, it's a question to Danny, who is not here. So let me formulate it as more like a comment, and also relate to the comment of Antonio, or rather the question whether the so-called Polish Holocaust law related somehow to the Russian 2014 law. And my answer would be highly unlikely. Well, first, the Russian law deals really with so-called glorification of fascism and Nazism and denying the verdict of the Nuremberg trial, whereas the Polish law deals specifically with the crimes, right? Either blaming the Poles for the crime of Holocaust or denying the crimes against the Poles. But what is interesting here is the role of Russia and also the Russian reaction to the Polish Holocaust law, which was actually absent Maria Zakharova, who is a public face of the foreign ministry, received this question in one of the press conferences shortly after the law has been adopted, and she said no comment, which is very interesting, counterintuitive. You would think they would like, to kick the Poles, but they didn't. And I think I know why. First of all, because of a Ukrainian element strong. I mean, they like how, the crimes of Ukrainians against the Poles were formulated in the law. And second, it's also a kick against Israelis. The previous summer, there was, it's kind of ongoing, so-called Sobibor memorial controversy, as you're familiar with it. Russia kind of invited itself to sit on the board, and Israeli didn't support that. So the Russians were really very upset. The Israeli ambassador was called to the carpet. They thought it was kind of almost a case of treason, given that very cozy relation between Russia and Israel when it comes to memory politics, particularly the Holocaust. So, yeah, thank you.
And then if you could pass exactly to Carolyn.
Thank you. I have a question for Professor Tim, and I applaud you for doing this very...
Yeah, just because it's hard maybe in
sorry.
the back for them to hear you.
It's a question for Professor Tim, and I applaud you for doing this very difficult work. There is a Holocaust survivor who works for the Toronto Holocaust Center, and she comes often to where I work to speak to the university students. And I've become quite close to her, and I asked her once, she is a Hungarian Jewish woman who survived Auschwitz, under really terrible circumstances. And I asked her, did you experience any sexual assault? And she said to me, I hate when people ask me this question. And I asked her why. And she said, because there's so much prurient interest in sex in the camps and violence. And students ask her about this all the time. And she really dislikes it. So that makes me wonder, you talked about the reasons why some survivors don't talk about sexual assault. Is this another reason? And how can historians collect the information properly then on Holocaust survivors? What do we do to fill in the spaces? That would be my question. Sorry.
So not exactly along the same lines, but also a question.
Oh, sorry, same thing. It's hard for them to hear maybe in the back. Is it okay to stand or?
Do I have to stand?
Oh, you got the notes.
I can speak loud if you want. All right. Okay. So the question really has to do about silences and noise. And that, that's really what your paper is about in some ways. And it's a fascinating question, in part because right after the war, there was a lot of talking. In other words, we know that German women talk to each other constantly about what happened to them at the hands of the Soviets, right? And in fact, we have the documents, which are in the Bundesarchiv. And they relate very straightforwardly all the many different ways, that they felt violated by what happened. I was just working, we had this conversation in the hallway in Moscow with firsthand depositions given by Soviet citizens once their towns and regions were liberated, and what they said. And women and men talked very openly about all kinds of sexual violations that happened to them and to their neighbors. They talked about themselves very openly. So part of the question then is, why does this shut down in some ways? And the other part of the question is historiographical. In other words, if you take the field that I know better, which is, the German-Russian set of issues, it was only into the 90s, right, that people began talking about. And there are specific kinds of reasons for that. We don't need to go into it. But, that's a long time after the war that historians took seriously what happened, at the end of the war and the beginning of the peace in Germany. Now, I can't remember, is it Miriam Gebert who wrote that book about the sexual crimes in the East by the Wehrmacht? That was only 3-4 years ago, or 5 years ago. It came out in German, then it was translated into English. But we're talking about very, very recent analysis on the part of scholars about sexual violence in the East by the Wehrmacht and by the Germans in general, right? There have been pieces of that story told, but we're really talking about something almost brand new. Now, what is the reason for the noise now? Does this, can you relate this to what we were talking about this morning a little bit? That is a kind of desacralization of the Holocaust. In other words, it seems in some ways that what people were talking about this morning is a kind of sense that, the Holocaust had been beyond, beyond history and historiography in some ways, that, there wasn't enough critical understanding of what was going on. Is that what the story is? Is it kind of, the fruits of feminism? Even Me Too? I mean, what are we talking about now that there's noise on this front? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, why not do both of you answer those as you like?
Oh, it's me. Okay. Excellent questions, which I'm not going to be able to entirely answer. The prurient interest, I think, is exactly a problem. And it's exactly why I focused in some detail on the porn and those kinds of things, this explosion of prurient interest, which I think plays all kinds of roles, not all of which I would argue are pornographic. In other words, some of it is an exploration of experience, misplaced, misread, but still there. Why, for instance, in the porn of the 70s are the women usually the sexual aggressors? This is something that needs to be explained. It is not simply, it comes from experiences, it comes from some of the propaganda, American propaganda about Nazi Germany that played to that theme. Now, we could go into a lot of detail about that prurient interest, but how do we get beyond it? I think we have to respect the survivors who don't want to always talk about it. We cannot force them to talk about it. So that means that that moment that they did speak openly about these experiences was a brief moment in the immediate aftermath. So we need to use those sources, many of which, as I said, are in Yiddish. I don't read Yiddish. This is an issue. But we also need to find the silences in other places. So in what I said here, I talked about the recordings of German POWs, but there's also pictures, there's video, there is imagery of this happening, for which we often do not know the individuals. We don't have the names. We don't have the kind of provenance that historians like to have. But we can read the context out of small amounts of information. So I would just say what we don't do. I mean, I can understand why you asked this question. It would be hard for me to not ask this question. I will go back to this woman who told me this story and get her full story that she has not been allowed to tell, because she wants to tell it. But those who don't want to tell it, I think we have to respect. And that means that we need to find it in other places. Now, I think Doris also mentioned this too, and Tony, there is a ton of this information. There was speech about it. It was widespread. Why does this shut down? I would say, in some cases, extremely practical reasons. These people needed to move on and establish lives, and this was not going to help them in any way. They needed to put it behind them, and it was not. We have to just respect that need for them not to talk about it. So that's part of the answer. The other part of the answer is that it wasn't. Who was the paper that talked about guilt, one's own guilt? Those who were investigating and coming up with the definitions of genocide knew that rape had happened in many other places, or these other kinds of sexual crimes, and it wasn't easy to integrate. Oh, I could go in so many different directions now. I think one of the things I wrote down later as I was thinking about this is the paradoxical silencing mechanisms. So there is, in these issues with sexual violence, there's two sides of the coin. There's one, this happens everywhere and always. It's not even, there's a refusal on the part of some people to think that it could be historicized, because it's just rape is war is rape, it's everywhere. And boys will be boys in some sense, and yet then the argument that it didn't happen because we can't really assimilate it into our systems of meaning, and we're not prepared in our present day. We are maybe now getting prepared in our present day, so Me Too does matter in these ways, to figure out, well, can't we stop saying it happens everywhere always? It has to be historicized, and it was. I mean, if you look. We don't have enough research, we don't have the statistics, we don't have anything like that. But wherever people have looked, these rapes occurred in far more frequency on the Eastern Front than in the West. It wasn't universal. We need to historicize this in a certain way. So there's all those different layers. There's popular culture. One of the things I would argue very strongly is that we not simply dismiss the smutty fictions, because they are part of the silencing mechanism. They are part of the discussion. It was the only place where these things were being discussed, where people could figure some of this out, some of the experiences that they had, even, say, American soldiers being attracted to German women, all of those kinds of things. And yet because they only put it in the frame of degradation, and because they get many things wrong, and it's not just smut, it's poems like the one that you talked about, this popularization on this level, it is part of what we need to understand. It is not simply something that historians should dismiss as simply wrong or mythological. It is part of the cultural mechanism that produces the silencing effect. I'll stop.
Want to go ahead? Can I add one thing, just in response, in response to Norman's question? I also think it's really important to differentiate silence and noise in popular culture from in the scholarship, because in fact, people were talking a lot, as obviously you know really, really well, both in cultural forms, but in families, in homes, and also in scholarship that did not get recognized. And I was thinking when you asked your question that one of the things that changed was your own book. So to have, I don't mean that to flatter. Mm-hmm. I mean to have someone who's a really important person in the field and who's a man write about the issue of rape, it opened doors. And I think about, for example, years ago I was on a prize committee. I read a dissertation by a historian, Wendy Jo Gertje Jansen. Some of you are familiar with her work. She wrote a fantastic dissertation about sexual violence, German Wehrmacht sexual violence in the occupied East. She interviewed tons of people. That dissertation was never published. And so the work was being done, but people didn't think this was serious scholarship. It wasn't a serious contribution. And so I think the issue of recognition is really important too. It's what is recognized, what's rewarded, who gets jobs, who gets grants, who's taken seriously when they stand up in front of a group of people, who's in the audience listening to them.
I did want to say something about that too, because there's a question, there's the discussion of it, but it's whether that discussion makes it into the meta-narrative, which is why I looked at David Cesarani's book, because Mark Roseman had praised him as carefully integrating rape, and I was pretty disappointed by the degree to which it was simply an episode mentioned. Another example I will give is I have heard from others that Saul Friedlander in his 2-volume History of the Holocaust, where he puts testimonies in, very raw, meant to be sort of unassimilated. He, I have heard from other sources, explicitly chose not to put in testimonies that deal with rape and sexual violence. Why exactly? We'll have to ask him, but there is a way in which this has been a very difficult subject to break into the meta-narrative and into high school education and into those other areas.
Rotem, do you want to respond to some of the...
I have a question addressed to me. I don't think I had it.
We'll take some more questions? Let's take some more questions. Okay, there's tons of people. So same thing, maybe we'll take 4 this round. We'll take these 2, one at the very back, and how about over there? Then we move around the room a bit. Where's our microphone? Yeah, so these 2 right here on this side.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I have a question for Annette. As I told you, I read your paper on the tube in London, and people were staring at me. Also, the paper looks very well read, often read even, so I don't know what they were thinking. So I'm a bit confused by your timeline. And I think what you need to do is to contextualize the period you're writing so much about, Holocaust smut in the 1960s, and a bit later, more into kind of the history of sexual liberalization and porn at the time, because we have all kinds of porn at the time, Austro-Hungarian, communist camps, whatever you name it. And I think it's not so uncommon, actually. And it's a particular time, but I think it doesn't say much about how we treat or how we don't treat the history of sexual violence during the Holocaust today. I think it's history, and it doesn't say much about today. And I don't want to sound like a denialist, but I don't think there's much of Holocaust pornography today. I think it's rather the opposite, because pornography does make us want to stare at things and look at it, and here the opposite is the case. We don't want to look at Holocaust-related sexual violence because it makes it feel very uncomfortable, and that's why scholars omit the topic, and there's other reasons too, of course. So I don't really see that the link to the porn thing. I might be wrong. And I think there's also differences maybe where scholars allow sexual violence to show up and to feature, and where it doesn't. I wouldn't be able to explain why that is. I think it's like mass rape in the field is something that they can relate to a little bit better and compare to a little bit better than sexual violence within camps. I wouldn't be able to say why though, but that's my gut feeling. So long comment short. I think it's actually the opposite of pornography, the problem that we as scholars are facing. And one little question for you also is, does it give us opportunities if we also broaden our focus in terms of history, of emotions, of sexuality, and include that whole field, which is also entirely missing from the histories of genocide? That's, of course, another kind of field, but it's also missing, I would argue, and I would kind of open up even a bit further. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentations and both comments as well. I think I agree with a lot of it, and I'm wondering a little bit, because my work focuses on the Armenian genocide in the contemporary context, and trying to understand the way in which, again, there's discussions of sexual violence in our narrations. And it seems that it's often focused within families, as you were saying, but not really transmitted in the public kind of commemorations or even discussions or transmissions to children, for example, even though the most horrific pictures can be shown to children, yet we don't talk about sexual violence. I'm wondering whether the turn towards a more serious engagement with oral history as part of a recognition that, well, oral history is true history, is the reason why we finally started to listen to women more, and men as well, and we started to really pay attention to autobiographies and consider those as part of the whole history of, whether it's the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide or even the more. And I understand that there are, the Rwandan context did provide more contextualization for sexual violence discussions, but it seems that a lot of the oral history literature is bringing forth that need to talk to people and becoming more legitimate way of actually incorporating sexual violence as a discussion in our understanding of genocide. Also, I'm wondering whether thinking of sexual violence opens up the opportunity to more critically think about the concept of genocide. I don't know what you think about it. I find that when we talk about sexual violence as a form of, or at least part of the definition of genocide, we are then criticizing the definition of genocide as an event-based phenomenon that's specific to a time, and it takes place, it ends, and then we're dealing with the repercussions. When we know that with sexual violence, a lot of the trauma continues on and on and on and on. So maybe that also can open up to what is called today in the field as decolonizing, understandings of genocide. So I don't know what you think about it or what your work does, but I'd be very happy to hear your perspective on that. So thank you so much.
Then all the way at the back.
Thank you. The only connections that I would see between the Russian memory law and the Polish is, two. They were both shaped by immediate political circumstances, and the other is that they were affected by concern about Ukrainians. In the case of the Russian law, it was originally proposed in 2009, put on hold for several years, and then abruptly revived in February of 2014. And it's very clear that that was the direct result of the ongoing crisis in Ukraine and the some of the statements that Russian officials began making about the advent of Nazis to the government in Ukraine. So that would be the only connection that I would see there. This does, though, come back to the question of sexual violence, that when I was at the SBU archive, the former KGB archive in Kiev last week, I was speaking to a young Dutch scholar who has been working with also a young Ukrainian scholar in putting together a history of sexual violence in the Soviet struggle against Ukrainian insurgents. And what they have been struck by is the extent to which this was a factor, including sexual humiliation of males, but also the extent to which it occurred on both sides. And it's, as he put it, it has been one of the most depressing things that he has come to realize, is that where people tend to focus much more on murder and other forms of violence, that this, in fact, seems to have been one of the most common on both sides, but particularly the Soviet federal, the Soviet Army's campaign. One consequence, though, of it is that as a result of the Russian memory law, he probably won't be able to go to Russia to work on this project because it will potentially leave him vulnerable to prosecution. It also may make him very unpopular in Ukraine as well. So in both countries, he may, after the book comes out, be excluded.
Then on this round, one more, and we'll get you on the next round.
Thanks. I've got a difficult question to ask Professor Tim. So it's very clear that sexual violence has been neglected in the literature, in scholarship on episodes of violence, and we can see some areas where it's been done relatively well. The Indonesian genocide, there's some really good work on sexual violence. In the case of Cambodia and China, very, very, very little. So really clear that we need more research in this area. You make a strong case for the value to research on sexual violence of including it within the definition of genocide. But I wonder about the other direction. What value does it have for research on genocide to include sexual violence? Our field is full of people who want to extend the definitions of genocide. I'm an advocate for extending it to include political genocides. Other people advocate including aerial bombing. Other people advocate including the extermination of indigenous peoples. So we all have our agendas for expanding the definition. And one of the things we've got to think about in arguing for those extensions is what we do to the concept when we include our field in that concept. So can you tell us what including the issue of sexual violence gives to the field rather than takes from it? Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, briefly on the timeline. Well, I think I'll start by sort of outing myself as not a scholar, really, of genocide or the Holocaust. I come to this topic from other directions, and so that probably has something to do with my different use of timelines. I think that you're absolutely right, Alex, that this 70s porn was not simply about the Holocaust. There's a whole woman in prison genre in the US. It really comes out of the pulp fiction stuff that has a wide diversity of various kinds of exploitative themes, and the Holocaust is just one in that realm. I won't go into the subject of how much the porn has to do. What I would just say is that there's the moment in the 70s, this was a moment of explosion in research on the Holocaust, and it was a moment where possibly there could have been a move towards this subject, that I would argue that this smut that was in the background and that was well known in Israel, in Italy, in North America, had a silencing effect. It made it harder to speak about sex in respectable forums. And that has lasting impact, because those Holocaust historians who were writing the best, most definitive things at that moment didn't go there. They didn't go there, and they have not very often gone there afterwards. So I would still make a claim that it's important. Genocide, Armenian. I'll just talk about oral history a little bit. I think one of the important moments, it gets back to the question that Norman asked too. I think one of the things that is really important with these subjects is that people who experience this kind of violence very often wait until they are retired and their children are grown to talk about it. So there's a real generational thing that happens after that first moment of speaking of it. It comes much later in life, and we saw this with the rapes of German women in Russia, the Soviet rapes of German women. They spoke about it. They spoke about it a lot as it was happening. Then they get on with their lives, and it comes up much later. So there's an issue of generation that I think, which is why we need to understand the emotions involved here and the family relationships that they involve. So it is not the individuals that we're talking about. When women, like you talked about, they also don't want to talk about this because they're not prepared to speak to their children about it. And we still as historians know that when we find these stories, that children who never heard them might be very upset. So there's a generational family issue that I think comes into this. In terms of the concept of genocide, which both of these two questions kind of get at, again, I sort of said I don't have a strong stake in the field of genocide studies myself, but I will still try to answer your question. What is the value of expanding it? In some sense, these are simply human experiences that are quite comparable. The experience of being abused in a Canadian residential school for First Nations peoples is not that different from the experience of the woman I talked about who was in a church in Poland. There are similarities in experience that we can talk about. So for that simple reason. So I would talk about human experience and not care so much myself about the specific definition of genocide. Having said that, I think when we move in this direction, we also see that there's a certain logic of this sexual violence that is also entwined with biopolitical schemes in general. So the whole notion of trying to manipulate an entire population plays into all of these things. I would argue, oddly, that this even goes back to porn, because biopolitical schemes, the idea that we should remove sex from families and safe spaces and have it medicalized in the most sort of ridiculous and not entirely true idea of what Nazis tried to do. It just goes to the medical realm and is no longer emotional. In some sense, that has the paradoxical effect of an incredibly of a seductive aspect. That freeing of sex frees it in various ways, and there's part of that in the genocidal logic. There's an opening. I'm getting myself tied up in knots a little bit. I think it's a very difficult. I would like to have a better answer for you, but I think that on one level, maybe the question of exactly how we contain genocide and how we expand it or not is misphrased, because the human experiences are too similar in different places.
Now, Frank, you wanted to say something, right?
I would generally want to say something, but not a specific answer to. Yeah, okay, then I'll make my comment now if it comes in. I worked predominantly on the 17th century, and when I did a book on a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth statesman of Ruthenian Ukrainian origin, who had written hundreds and hundreds of letters, one of the reviewers rather scathingly said that I had avoided his attitudes towards Jews and what had happened during the Khmelnytsky revolt, and this really was a great failing of the book. In fact, he never once mentioned them. And indeed, one who looked at the Polish aristocracy of that time would find out that Jews were not mentioned. The struggle between the Cossacks and the Polish elite was. I find when I look at some of the memoir literature for the 20th century, particularly from Eastern Galicia, that Ukrainians write about Poles and Poles write about Ukrainians, and Jews often drop out of the general discussions of these conflicts. And why did I think of it? Because I must admit, this is not my specialty. I looked at Professor Blattman's papers, and for me, of course, the revelation was that the Holocaust law in Poland is about the Holocaust and has something to do with Israel. Because all I would know from reading Ukrainian internet is that this was one more attack by the Poles on Ukrainians, and that this was one more sign of Polish politics, with Israel being left out very largely of the discussion. Now, I'm sure that those who look more deeply in it would find that this is not true, that there are people writing on it. But when Professor Blattman said that no one is paying attention to this Article 55, I thought, then why am I getting all this stuff and all these emails specifically about these Ukrainian clauses? I think it is of some interest because it also relates to some of the things that were said now about Russian and Polish policy. And I also, after reading this paper, think, and what is Israeli policy on what is this emerging triangle on it? So that would be my only observation as someone who is not really working on this, but just looking at what's going on in Ukraine, where we had the Babin Yar and other commemorations of last year, which looked like, in some ways, steps forward on Jewish and Israeli, Jewish Ukrainian and Israeli Ukrainian relations. And my impression is in Ukraine, the Jews in Israel are disconnected from the issue of this Holocaust law and what's going on in Poland. And one step that I can think of, I was just yesterday contacted by those who are putting up the monument on the 1st of November for the proclamation of the Western Ukrainian People's Republic or National Republic. And that was their question to me. What should be on the monument? What's the right English for Narodna, which is a big problem in Western Ukrainian? And I thought how different that situation is this November the 1st than it would have been 5 years ago, November the 1st. And this is the 100th anniversary, but that's not the real issue. Now this is now a new kind of statement. But of course, it's going to be entirely on Polish issues.
Hey, wait, you got because I got a few people ahead. So, no. I know, but let me let you talk because we got a few people, otherwise we'll never get them all in. We have till 5:15. So we're going to take you, we're going to take you, we're going to take you, we're going to take Piotr. And he had his hand up for a long time, and we'll try to get you in too. So hopefully put a member. Let's start with her.
I'll be brief. I just wanted to speak to the element of visual culture and pornography in this discussion, because I think we also should be suspicious of the term pornography because it's always a label closely related to censorship and relative to different regimes and different artists at different times and places. That being said, representations of violence, especially sexual violence, can be incredible heuristics for education, for Holocaust education. And more generally, unfolding out of that for looking at rape as a crime or not a crime in other times and places where sexual practices, including rape, were part of the institutionalization of a state regime. In my classroom at Kiev Mohila last year, I invited a filmmaker to show his film, which largely features his anarchist grandfather raping his grandmother in the setup of the Bolshevik state, which they both then became, party to. And my students were really shocked because the depiction of this rape was so not violent and so unpornographic. And they really were pushing the filmmaker to moralize the situation. But actually, I think his representation was radical in the sense that he left the interpretation up to the viewer, and in doing this was showing how a lot of the time the banality, to go back to Hannah Arendt, of these moments becomes almost invisible to us and we take it for granted. So that's just an anecdote that I wanted to share. Next.
Now she's going to run it way back there. Sorry, guys, but, you know, we have to.
Thank you. And my question is to Professor Tim. Recently, I read a book about it's called The Armenians in Modern Turkey, the Post-Genocide Society. And one thing that struck me, among other things that the author was talking about, was actually the absence of space where people can talk about their experiences, especially experiences that particularly women were subjected to, the kidnapping and everything. And the author actually contextualized it with the fact that unless we, in the post-genocidal societies, when that space is not created, it's in a way we're denying the fact of genocide. And I wondered if you agree with that statement in terms of if we're not creating that space, if those stories are not accounted for, even though other violent actions are accounted for, can we still claim that the genocide is being denied? Thank you.
Now, Piotr and Andreas. Mm-hmm.
Sorry for this, but there is a misunderstanding here. The term, the Holocaust law, has been coined by journalists and politicians. The proper name of this bill is the law about the Institute of National Remembrance. And the law was accepted in 1998 and included a lot of things, not only World War II, not only the Holocaust, but many, many, many things. And then, in the early 2000s, there were two attempts to amend the law. Both times, the Constitutional Tribunal said no. But at that time, the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland did work, and the law was stopped. The law is very similar to Russian and Turkish, by the way, because it threatens people with fine or prison up to 3 years. This 3 years is both in Turkish law and in Russian law, and recently it was in the Polish law. So in the early 2000s, the Constitutional Tribunal stopped the law, but now in 2018, the Constitutional Tribunal does not exist anymore as a valid institution. It doesn't play its role, so the law went through. But it was not just about the Holocaust, and it's called the law about the Institute of National Remembrance, and includes a lot of things, now starting with 1917 to 1990, surprisingly, right? And these are, again, journalists and politicians who did it to us. Thank you.
Oh, wait, pass right to right.
So I'm sorry.
Yes, I have two very brief statements and a question, and then an addition. The brief statement is, now, just to go back to our conference concept. Of course, these memory laws, because he's perfectly right, this is a memory law, it's not an Holocaust, that show precisely how dangerous it is to venture in using an ethical, legal concept as a guide to research, because you end up opening the road to politicians to norm research and studying, because these are ethical, legal concepts, are not historical interpretive tool at that point. So it's a very, how to say, tricky and I think dangerous exercise. This is also why I'm not happy with the way we use the category, let's say. The second, it's a confirmation that it's absolutely true. I don't know why, because, you know, in the historical profession, witnesses has always been the most important source, much more than if you read Thucydides and whatever. The eyewitness is the most important. Then, strangely, and still in spite of the professionalization of history, still in the 19th century, witnesses were greatly used. And then I would say, I don't know precisely when, but I would say after World War II, to use witness up to the 1980s was almost not a good idea. But I was censored, for example, by a very famous professor I will not mention, because I used foreign workers' testimonies for the Soviet history. He told me, you cannot use memoirs. It's insane. You should use archival documents and political and economic data. But really, and I took it. I didn't publish. So really, this was, let's say, something that was there and then changed in the 1990s. And this is one of the, I'm not a big fan of the cultural term, but this was a great, let's say, opening that it gave us, that we could start again to use witnesses. Now, the big question is, of course, sex is important, and we should open it. But the question Robert was asking is very important. That is, how this change our idea. Let's say, I prefer not of genocide or mass categorical violence. How does it change the category? That's the real question.
Take a second shot at it.
No, and second is, since I'm convinced that this was very important, but I'm also convinced that this was not as important and similar in all the genocides we consider. For example, I'm sure that it was very important in the Armenian case. We know that was important. I don't know if it's genocide is the word, but since it was a decision of the tribunal in Serbia, it was important in the former Yugoslavian Republic. Probably it was important in Rwanda, as far as I understand. And surely sexual violence was a major component against Slavic women and then German women. You know, the German race pride, right, was the slogan. This was a clear incitation to rape, as Norman reminded us very properly. I'm not so sure that is, are we really sure that Germans would use this in the Shoah, as a tool against, is this the same? Because from many points of view, as much as I read this, I didn't find this so much. And the addition is, so that maybe that the racial Nazi ideology and control played a role in, they killed them. And the addition is, there was not only the lurid pornography on this in the 70s, in the films. Because at least in Italy, 3 major films were produced by great authors that dealt with it. And this was, of course, Capot by Gillo Pontecorvo, the one from the Battle of Algeri. And there was The Portiere di Notte by Liliana Cavani. And there the sex was after, not during. And when she found yes, was after the conclusion of the war, because when she finds the persecutor, the Nazi that now works in a hotel in the night, then she starts this. And the other, of course, is Pasolini, which is the most terrible one, about the 120 days of Sodoma. And this is, and all of them are in the 70s. That is, no, Capot is 1960s, but the other 267, I wanted to check, is 74 and 75, which is quite, in the 70s, they really have a problem with this. So I agree with you.
We're going to take, because we have to be out of here exactly at 5:15, so we're going to see if our speakers have time to answer. But I saw 4 questions. I think we're going to take all 4, because it's interesting to hear what everyone says. So 2 are on this side, and then Alon and Anna.
So I have a similar question, and it also goes to Professor Tim, and you may not be able to answer, but I'd invite you to speculate. So in political science, there's been a lot of research on recently on rape in civil war, and I think the question that I have is sort of two related questions. One is, do you think there's anything systematically different about sexual violence in genocide compared to other forms of violence? And is there any and this gets to Andrea's question, is there any kind of variation across genocides or cases of mass categorical violence? Can we start to put some bounds on this? And again, I recognize it's more of a social science question than a historian question, but voila.
Pass over to your neighbor.
I just wanted to add a comment to Professor Kriebe and Professor Tim's discussion about what does adding sexual violence to the definition of genocide do to add value. And I guess my comment is that it reframes it hypothetically would reframe the Genocide Convention to really include a much stronger focus on the experience of women as well as the experience of men. We know at the time when the Genocide Convention was drafted, the experiences of men predominated. The focus has been heavily on killing in terms of statistics and the sorts of evidence that has been gathered, and having that explicit focus on sexual violence has some potential to redress that. Now, we know, of course, from the ICTY and the ICTR that rape can constitute a crime of genocide, but that explicit focus, I think, could really add value to the way we consider gender within the experience of genocide.
One sentence that answers a bunch of those questions? No?
Can
Okay.
you hold, because we only have till 5:15,
hold.
and so let's take the last two, and then you can wrap up. So we're going to have Alana and we're going to have Anna, because we got to end exactly. Sorry.
I'd like to add a thought to this important discussion about sexual violence and genocide. It seems to me that we are speaking here about mass phenomena of rape, a concentrated policy of many soldiers. And just like one killing is not a genocide, so one rape in a war is not mass rape that belongs to genocide. But when mass rapes exist, when they happen, it's part of a campaign of killing, of ethnic cleansing, or of genocide. They don't just happen and then the soldiers go back home and that's it, obviously. So it's part of genocide. It's part of the phenomena we call genocide. And there is an intent to change the body politics in the most physical, reproductive way. And when this happens, we as scholars have to take it into consideration, just like if you try to starve one village, this is not a genocide. If you starve a whole nation, this is a genocide. So similarly, it seems to me obvious that this is one weapon against the weak in a context of killing and expulsions that is really attacking the womb, the reproductive capacities of this group. Seems to me obvious that it's part of the process. It's not a standalone.
Last question.
I don't want it to be the last question, but I was thinking about, I don't know, sorry, your name, sir. Andrea, question, and also the earlier one about, is this part, I'm less interested in what's genocide, what makes a genocide, but I'm thinking that everyone who studies sexual violence knows that essentially it's a study of silence. And then you develop all these strategies of how you look into oral history of silence, or even language that's silenced. Yiddish is a good example of, silencing a lot of those voices and all this. But I was thinking, and that's inspired by what Doris said, that we have all these sources that where we don't expect find the information of sexual violence. Black Book is one of them. But also the narrative of perpetrators, or better yet, narratives of rescue. Just came back from an oral history conference in Montreal with this really interesting political scientist from, his name is Keel Anderson, did an interview. He was interested in interviewing perpetrators of Indonesia, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Rwandan genocide, a little bit of Yazidis. So he wanted to know why people kill. And he goes to all these places with translators, a lot of grant money and all this. And he wants to know, he sits with his eyes burning, the pictures of that. And they don't want to talk about this. All they want to talk about how they rescued people from, guess what, rape. And suddenly, here's a story of genocide. And I'm curious, if we go look at all these Yad Vashem righteous people and their testimonies, would they be like all these stories of sexual violence? And suddenly it answers a lot of questions. How widespread is it? Is it a real part of Holocaust and all that kind of stuff? So comment in the spirit of this conference. Thank you.
And now we're going to give our speakers literally like a minute or two. Sorry, but you know, there's time to continue, I hope.
I'm not going to answer all those questions, but the one thing that came to me as many of you were asking the question that I think is important to say and maybe gets at the question of why this is necessary to understand for genocide and why genocidal situations might be slightly different than civil wars. There is something in the way that sexual violence occurs in genocide that is a group experience for the men involved in doing it. It is a motivating factor. It is a bonding moment that is part of the experience. I think that's probably a little different in non-genocidal wars. It still exists. Obviously, we know it exists in frats, you know, in male fraternities. But I think that the way that it plays out, the feelings about it afterwards, might be a distinction. But I think, Doris, you did mention this. I think it's an incredibly important aspect. And I can just recommend to you an article by Alyssa Mailander who talks about one picture of a rape and tries to explain the 8 soldiers around all laughing about this. That laughter needs to be explained, and it's part of the mechanism. So we need that to understand the motivation. These men, I'll stop.
And that's a body of a woman who's dead.
What's that?
The picture, the woman is dead.
Yes, the woman is dead.
It's really important.
Yeah.
Any last words you want to make? Last words? Please join me in thanking our speakers and all of our sponsors.